Welcome to Dear Book Coach. I'm Stephanie Detlefs, writer and certified book coach.
I'm Terry Thayer, author, certified book coach, certified focusing professional.
And I'm Carrie Savage, certified book coach, writer, and project manager.
And this is a friendly advice space for you as you plan, draft, and revise your novel. In each video, we answer one question submitted by a writer like you with our 3 different points of view, and you get to pick the advice that resonates with you. So today's question comes from Stacy. Can you please talk about the difference between character voice and author voice? So Terry, I'm going to throw that to you first.
Yeah, well, as far as I'm concerned, there's rarely a place for author voice in fiction, especially for a beginning writer. I think all of your speaking should be done through the character's voice. I mean, like in the 70s and 80s, we had a lot of Portnoy, people, disguising themselves as a fictional character to speak about their lives and their views and things, but that has kind of gotten out of fashion. So I would say do all your speaking through your character's voice. She may have the same political views or social status or economic background as the author, but she is not the author. To me, anytime we can hear the author's voice, it's an intrusion. So character voice develops as you get to know the character, as you explore your deep level why and the point of your story. Your character develops her uniqueness, and her voice comes from her backstory, her misbelief, and how her experiences have shaped her. That's why it's important to do that pre-work that we book coaches love to identify these things. Why are you writing this book? What's your point? What's your character's misbelief? Making sure your character doesn't sound like everyone else does not mean giving them verbal tics or an accent. Please don't give them an accent. Nothing worse than reading dialect as far as I'm concerned. Again, it comes from that deep knowing of your protagonist so that what she says sounds like her. We all know people who speak in a certain cadence or use certain words and don't use others, and that's fine. So just no other character thinks like her, reacts like her. Ideally, this is something to really work on. We should know who's talking without attribution. It's not easy, but it's great if you can do it, at least even part way. So know what type of words your character would know. Does she use big words? Does she use small words? But more importantly, know what's in her heart so that it can come out on the page sounding just like her. Leave your author voice for letters to the editor or your annual Christmas letter to your family. That's what I have to say. Carrie?
So yeah, I'm gonna agree with I think quite a bit of what you said. I mean, in both cases, I feel like when someone talks about voice, whether it's character or author, they're indicating that there's something sort of identifiable about whoever that person is that they're talking about, whether it's the character or the author. So it's something unique, it's something identifiable, it's a way of recognizing them. But I'm going to probably repeat a little bit of what Terry said here, but character voice is the voice of your protagonist or another person in your novel. It's the point of view from which we are seeing the plot of the novel unfold. So that can be one protagonist, or if you have multiple points of view, you want to make sure that those voices are distinct. And we've talked about this in other contexts before. So to Terry's point, ideally, if you were to start a chapter, I mean, you do always want to give your reader these signifiers, but if you were to start a chapter with someone, you've switched point of view, the reader should be able to figure out, without doing too much work and without reading too far in, who the heck is talking, because you've made that character's voice identifiable enough that the reader is going to know, oh yeah, that's so-and-so. I feel like author voice generally isn't really present or heard from unless, in that very rare case where I guess maybe you're using an omniscient point of view and you're specifically acknowledging that it's you, the writer, you're really breaking that fourth wall that way. And then when I started to think about this in terms of formulating an answer to this question, I got into the like, but is it even then you really the author if you're like directing us and we know that it's you talking to us? I got very existential, very meta very quickly. And it's probably why it's really, really hard to do. And why, yeah, it almost probably never happens and probably never should, because it is something that's really, really difficult and so really hard to do well. But yeah, so more generally, I think it's terminology that's used to describe the tone or the style or other elements that makes someone's work identifiable as X person. So when someone talks about author voice, that is sort of what I think of like, oh, you know, there's a certain style that a person writes in, whether it's very prosy or very succinct or any of those other kinds of markers where, you know, rather than using the example of picking up and, you know, identifying a character's point of view when you're reading through, if you were to pick up a book and didn't see the cover and so you didn't know who wrote it, but you started reading and you're like, oh, that's so-and-so. You know that because they have a very distinct voice as an author, a very distinct tone or style. So I don't really have any examples, but I think Stephanie has some examples for us. So I will toss it over to you, Stephanie, to further enlighten us.
Well, I don't know about that, but yeah, so I don't have a lot more to say about character voice than what Terry and Carrie have already said. I think you guys did a nice job. One thing I would just add as another layer is that a way to develop your character's voice, whether it's in their dialogue or if it's in first person, so the entire story is being told in their voice, then the best way to, for me, the best way to get there and to really refine that is to embody them. We've talked about this in past videos where you actually imagine yourself in the body of that character and considering like what is happening in their physical body that is causing their response to the world. What emotions are driving it? You know, are they generally kind of snarky? Are they generally kind of anxious? Are they generally kind of, and it'll change as the story goes, but that's just another layer for character voice. But I think you guys covered that really well. I agree with what Carrie was saying about author voice being synonymous more or less with tone and style of the overall book in fiction. I think even with an omniscient narrator, that narrator is still someone other than the author. Like you'll have to develop that omniscient narrator's voice. That's not the author, that's the narrator, that's somebody else. You know, I think about a really obvious, clear example of that is in The Book Thief by Marcus Zusak, where the omniscient narrator is actually deaf. So that narrator is actually characterized, which isn't always the case in a book, but that's a separate tone, a separate voice than the author's voice. I think the author's voice is less about what's said than how it's said, like Carrie was saying. And I do think that there is a place for it in fiction. I think there's a place for it in all fiction. I think it's something that gets developed over time for writers. So writers of multiple books, if they have a strong sense of their voice, you'll start to see that voice and tone over time. So much like Terry was saying about a character, when that character appears and starts talking, ideally you'll know as the reader who that character is without it being attributed to them. Similarly, with an author's voice, you might start to see that across multiple books that they've read. So some examples of that I've seen, and there's more than this, but Ian McEwan is like that for me, who wrote Atonement. Marcus Zusak, who wrote The Book Thief, and he's also written The Bridge of Clay. I felt like even though those two books were very, very different, the tone, like it was Marcus Zusak that was writing them. And I think Jennifer Weiner has that. And I think that Jacqueline Woodson, who writes mostly middle grade and children's books has that as well. She just has a very clear point of view that comes across because of the content that she writes. You know, I think that's a part of it too, is the issues that you're choosing to include in your book. I think all of that contributes to author's voice. And you know, not every book or every writer has a style that sets them so far apart that it's noticeable, but I think everyone has an author's voice. And I think that what we can strive for over time is to start to hone it a little bit and really kind of own it and say, this is my approach. And if it changes over time, that's fine too. I mean, I don't think it's a right or wrong answer. I'll just quickly say as my own example that, you know, I write middle grade fiction and I write creative nonfiction essays, and my essays have a very clear tone because I've been doing it for a lot longer. So even if my topics are different, I write the same way every time, the same kind of sentence structure, my words, it looks the same on the page. I mean, that's what I have honed, and my fiction is a little newer to me, so I'm still finding my voice there. I think it's something you strive for over time, but I don't think that a book is a failure if it's not the first thing that a reader notices, you know what I mean? So that's what I have to say. I just think I want everybody to sort of find their voice and to own their voice and to feel like it's okay to put it on the page. That's my opinion.
Well, yeah, I mean, there is a reason, like I will pick up any Sue Miller book that I see because I like what Sue Miller writes. And, you know, there may be disappointments, but most of the time we have our favorite authors for a reason. And I guess if we're calling that author voice, then that makes perfect sense. And I don't know that you can, I mean, I think you can hone it and own it. Like we need that on a t-shirt, but
Own it.
but it is just, if you're writing authentically, I think it'll come through.
Yeah.
Just don't try to have your characters say things that you as the author believe.
Yeah.
I
I think character voice is more craft based. Like you can really work on that and mold it like Play-Doh. And I feel like author voice comes more organically and more over time.
Yeah. It's more who the author is, I think.
Yeah.
And I was laughing when you talk about character voice because I was in a Zoom writing class today and I was like trying to, okay, if she's doing this, my hands were like doing things that my character was doing because I was trying to picture how would that work. So yeah, if you're in a coffee shop and you see somebody doing weird things, it's just an author working on their character.
Well, Carrie's done sword fighting in her living room.
Yeah. We know about that.
Yep, sure did.
So that's it for today. We hope that you found an answer that made sense to you at this point in your life, at this point in your book. Remember, you can submit your question anytime at Dear Book Coach and sign up for our email while you're there. If you do, you're eligible for a monthly drawing of a call with a coach. See you next time.